Welcome to the Hero Maker podcast. I'm Andrea Schreeman, writer, director, EP, living in LA.
I'm Jennifer Morrison, and I currently serve as the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Vermont.
We are here to seek out and tell the full story of our friends who were murdered in college, Rachael Raver and Warren Fulton III.
We really need to make sure that their deaths were not in vain and that every possible lesson and improvement for the system can be squeezed from the retelling of the circumstances that ultimately led to the identification of their killer.
Well, welcome to season 2.
We are certainly starting off with a bang. I was really looking forward to this, and oh boy, it delivered.
Yeah, we got to speak with Tom Jackman, who's a 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post journalist, and he covered our friend's case starting in 2000 and all the way through to the execution of Alfredo Prieto.
He's a guy with a lot of experience under his belt, and his renown for his fairness, his in-depth investigative work, which is not so much in the forefront anymore. There's not that many folks out there to this day being recognized as true investigative journalists, and he enjoys that reputation from the past, but also from the present. And I was really looking forward to him. It harkens back to my journalism major at GW and how I thought I had aspirations of being a journalist just like him. So it was really nice to talk to him.
Yeah, he's a great guy, and he's been very generous with us. And I think a lot of it has to do with how impactful this case was for him and how much it continued to stay with him throughout the years. We're very grateful that he sat down with us and really excited for our audience to hear this conversation with Tom Jackman.
I had printed out that chronology that I gave to you, but then I think I ran out of there without actually taking it off the printer. But
So
I
you're going to
think
pull
I
it
have
up?
a copy here. I heard you reference it in the last podcast, in the Sally podcast.
Yeah.
Sweet Sally.
She's the best.
Yeah.
Tom, can you start for our audience? First of all, amazing to be here with you.
Yes.
I started talking to you 2.5, maybe 3 years ago. You have provided so much context and were very generous from the beginning with sharing your knowledge and your notes and helping me have direction to how to navigate this exploration. And then your bowing out actually allowed Jen and I to go on this really beautiful journey together, which has been so wonderful for our friendship and for pursuing the details of our friends' deaths. So thank you for everything.
Yeah. Thank you for quitting.
Yeah.
You're doing a hell of a job. I'm really inspired to listen to the whole rest of the journey. I've listened to parts of it. Now I'm going to hear the whole thing because the parts I've listened to have really been fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you.
That means a lot coming from you, sir.
You've done a great job.
Can you share with our audience just a general snapshot of your career, what you're doing now?
To us, you are like this iconic Washington Post journalist.
Pulitzer Prize winning.
Yes.
2.
Times 2. And so that is something we want our audience to know a little about, but we just want you to introduce yourself in the way that you want to be known to our listening audience.
Well, I'm Tom Jackman. I'm a longtime criminal justice reporter. Been at the Washington Post since 1998, so coming up on the 25-year mark. I was at the Kansas City Star and Times for 14 years before that as a criminal justice reporter, and I graduated from college and spent 2 years at the New York Times shuffling paper and taking orders. That's sort of my journalism career. I've covered a lot of breaking news. I've written a lot about policing. I've written a lot about courts, covered a lot of big trials. And there are very, very few cases that stand out like this one does. The killings of Warren and Rachael happened not far from where I grew up in Reston, Virginia, and at a place that I drove past approximately 1 million times growing up when it was just an empty field. It's now all houses. And I knew all of the the parties involved in terms of the lawyers and the cops. And I wasn't really focused in on it because it happened in 1988, and I moved back here in 1998. I'm born and raised in Northern Virginia, one of the very few people at the Washington Post who's actually from here. I moved back here in 98 to cover the Fairfax Police and Courts beat. And I think it was about 2 or 3 years after that, that the Arlington police made the announcement that they had connected the DNA from their unsolved murder of Tina Jefferson with the unsolved murders of Rachael and Warren. And so that was my first story. And that was the first time that I met Dee Dee Raver, whom I stayed in touch with over the years, and then just continued to follow the story. And I was fairly friendly with Bob Murphy and Steve Milewski, the two cold case detectives, who submitted the DNA over and over and were the ones that got the hit on Prieto. I think he was in San Quentin when he got the hit. It was always difficult for me to get out of California. How was it that they did DNA testing on somebody that was already in prison and sentenced to death in California? But it turned out that a bill had passed in California that enabled them to go through the prisons and test everyone that was already in there. And that was what put Prieto's DNA into the national database. And so the next time that Murph and Milewski submitted the DNA, there was a hit, and off we went.
You started covering it once Arlington made the announcement that there was a connection?
Right. Yes, it had happened 10 years before I'd gotten here, so I wasn't really familiar with the case until then.
Did you have any contact with Tina Jefferson's mom?
I did. I spoke to her and to Mr. Jefferson a number of times over the years. I think that my first contact with the family was with Mr. Jefferson. I think that's who I spoke to in 2001. Is that the date when the match was made?
2000.
In 2000?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep, I see it. May 2000, DNA links Jefferson case. I was unawares of this murder, these multiple murders, much less all the murders that this guy did prior to that.
So when you first became aware that this was a case worth tracking down, right? The two cases are linked in the greater Washington area.
Right.
Did you ever imagine that you were going to wind up reporting on a serial rapist and serial murderer with deep gang ties?
It's hard to know. I guess the short answer is no, I didn't imagine that, although here's 3 victims attributable to one person. So that's halfway down the road to serial killer. They still needed a hit. They still needed a break at that point in 2000. There was like, okay, now one person has killed all 3 of these folks, but we have no idea who that is. And how many years was it until
5?
Let's see. It was, April 2004, they took the swab. June 2005, they notified Virginia of the hit. 5 years.
So that means you were in touch with DNA specialists as well.
Virginia was sort of on the forefront of that. And we had a guy at our crime lab who liked to talk about it, Dr. Ferrara, and he was very helpful over the years. And they were keeping track of how many cases they were solving. It was a great new thing, this DNA. And so they were very proud that they were making this happen in Virginia.
I may be jumping ahead right here. What was like the most shocking thing that occurred or that you uncovered in your investigation?
I mean, I think the most shocking thing is how much he did that we know of, right? 9 victims.
Well, did you know Murphy gave us a 10th?
He did.
Mm-hmm.
I'm making to that part of your journey soon, but 10 victims. And this weird MO of taking 2 people, you don't see that often. And you often don't see sexual assault and a gun, which is sort of an unusual MO. Rape and shoot. Usually you have rape and strangle or rape and stab. I hate to be horribly blunt about that, but it's an unusual technique. And it's what he did to Yvette Woodruff in California, outside of Ontario, the one that he got captured for in 1990. So he's in prison as of 90. And we don't even hear about him for 15 years after that. But in the meantime, he had abducted and killed more people in California after leaving here. Let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 more victims after leaving. So Bob would say that there's a 5th one in Washington, D.C., right? That they could never figure out who it was because they had so many murders in Washington. They're like, oh, somebody got killed in a bar? Yeah. Great. Can you narrow that down a little bit? And they're like, no. I've always credited him with 9 just because I couldn't find out and the DC cops couldn't tell us who the 10th was. But I know that the Fairfax police believe that there was another murder in Washington, D.C., in addition to 2 in Fairfax County, 1 in Arlington County, and 1 in Prince William County. And these are all counties just west of Washington.
You have a lot of experience covering ghoulish cases, sometimes very complex cases. Knowing what we know now, should it surprise us if someday we find out he's linked to more cases?
No, I think that it will happen. They probably need to be running his DNA against unsolved cases all over California, all over, New York and DC. I guess maybe he could have committed some murders that he didn't leave DNA on. If he shot somebody, that's a way to do it without leaving that physical evidence.
He also liked to set things on fire.
And there's that. And it seems to me that there's, blocks of time where things didn't happen that we know of. So September 1989 is the last known homicide attributed to him out here. And then the next one isn't for 7 or 8 months, May of 1990, when he abducts a young couple and shoots them. And then in June of 1990, abducts an older couple and shoots them. And then in September of 90, is involved in the 3-victim horrendous abduction and rape, which you guys have talked about already. And you've interviewed one of the victims from that case who survived. So he was arrested fairly soon after that. But there's blocks of time where he certainly could have, committed more mayhem.
What struck me when I first started to learn about the number of deaths he was responsible for, because part of our plan from the beginning was, I have not researched this. Andrea knows all of this, and I've been learning it as we go along. I did not know anything beyond the Tina Jefferson and Warren and Rachael link in the beginning of our journey. What has struck me as we've gone along is that he appears to be a completely indiscriminate killer. The elderly couple,
right,
and then a young couple,
right,
2 fit athletes, Rachael and Warren, a white female, a black female, like literally an indiscriminate killer. 15-year-old Yvette.
As part of a group of 3.
I've never heard anything like it.
Right. I haven't either. And you're right, that those are a lot of different folks. It doesn't make sense. It is indiscriminate. It makes me wonder, was there anybody else around at the time of the abduction? Because all of these people went missing without anybody knowing to this day how that happened. How did Rachael and Warren get in a car with this guy? Did he get them at some place that they stopped to eat? Did he get them when they came out of the bar in DC? How did they get to Reston, of all places, Reston, Virginia, which is about 17 miles straight west of the city, but not where Warren and Rachael were going? I've heard you talk before, and I think you're right that there actually is some kind of higher level intelligence going on here. One of the things about that is committing crimes where you don't get caught. A lot of criminals don't think about that, right? They leave trails, they leave clues, and this guy didn't. And the only clue he left was his own DNA.
The one clue that we've uncovered that seemed significant to me about this question of how did he take custody of his victims, right?
Right.
We have the case that one of the detectives talked about where he became aware when he was in cold case investigations that he had actually interviewed Alfredo Prieto under a different name 10 years earlier as a rape case suspect. And it was a case where a woman was driving her car and she got bumped from behind. And so she pulled over on the side. Was it 66, Andrea? Was it Route 66, I think?
Sounds right.
Anyway, she pulls over and this man comes up and puts a long-barreled 357 in her face and says, "You're coming with me." And he takes her back to his apartment, rapes her over the course of a day or a weekend. I don't remember exactly the length of the thing. And she made a choice that she was going to pretend it was a date and not be awful and struggle and, not try to escape. And he took her back to her car at some point. She went immediately to the police, gave them all kinds of detail. The case was investigated. The detective and another colleague go out. He's the junior guy on the sex crimes.
This is Murphy.
Unit. Murphy on the sex crimes unit. He's the junior detective. They go to the apartment that the woman identified, and a guy matching the description answers. He provides an ID. Okay. And he says, oh, yeah, she was here all weekend. That was totally consensual. We're friends, blah, 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 blah. Like he had enough info about her. So this case kind of was one of those he said, she said. And eventually they end up getting a warrant for him for something that was not sexual assault, right? Wasn't it ag assault or
Yeah.
unlawful restraint or something like that? And they go to serve it and he's long gone, right? So, okay, that case kind of fizzles.
Wow.
So 10 years later, he gets the boxes of stuff of Rachael and Warren's cases.
From the California adjudication, right? So
Okay.
the guys out in California send him their big box of information.
And so he's describing his process, Detective Murphy, as of holding up in an office and just going through every photo, every document, and out falls a picture of a driver's license in a different name with Alfredo Prieto's picture on it. And it's the guy he interviewed as a rape suspect 10 years earlier.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a great story. Wait till you hear Murphy tell it. Yes, but I think what you're pointing to, Jen, is the bump and rape, what we were calling bump and rape. Like that was one of his techniques, was that we realized from that. And by the way, the name of the woman, when he was relaying the story, her name was Suzette. This woman who was raped and then held overnight and then went back to the police and asked that. And I remember that name was also one of Prieto's wives, I think.
Right.
So that confused me. I thought that was kind of surprising. So anyway, we have the technique.
Oh, he had a child named Suzette.
Oh, he had a child named Suzette.
Yes.
I'm very curious
Sandy
about this
Figueroa.
point of his wives, his former wives, and the kids, because I know there are 2 known children.
Right.
And I'd love to hear anything that you're aware of in that department.
Not a lot. So you've got Sandy Figueroa as a child, who I have down as Suzette, but I think she also goes by Sandy. And I think that's who you were looking for, or I think that's who you made contact with, because she had made contact with me once, and then she beefed at me because you had called her.
So then why did she get in touch with you originally? Do you remember?
It was around the time of the execution. And I think she wanted to talk about that. I'm not sure. I think that she called me after the execution.
Maybe share her story kind of thing.
Right.
This is the ex-wife or the daughter that goes by the same name?
I think it was the daughter.
That makes more sense.
Who would have been born in 1983, which would make her, close to 40 now. And so, yeah, somebody who was in her 30s 7 or 8 years ago when the execution was. I have him as marrying her. And then I have him.
That sounds like a California relationship before
Absolutely.
he ever came out to Virginia.
Right. I have him marrying her in 1983.
And they were young. I mean, that's young.
That's right. He's born in November of 65, so he's 17 at the time of the marriage. And then the following year, he does a drive-by shooting at some guy who had previously gone out with Sandra Figueroa. So he was a juvenile at that time, still 18 years old, was sentenced to 3 years in juvie and walked away from the juvenile center. And so when they caught him, he was put in adult jail or adult prison until 1986. So he wound up doing 2 years of a 3-year sentence, which in California is got to do really bad to serve a lot of your time in California. And that's one of the reasons why he was brought out here, was because California was notorious for not executing anyone or for letting people out early.
So the first known criminal justice involvement that we know of for Alfredo Prieto was when he was 17 years old or 18?
I have him as 18. It was a drive-by shooting in August of 1984.
But he didn't kill anyone during that. He just...
No, I think that the guy was shot in the leg, if my memory serves. And he pleaded guilty to that 2 months later, October of 84. He's still 18. So probably trying to get in under the juvenile wire, if that's the line in California. I'm guessing it is, because he was sentenced to juvenile jail, which he then ran from.
Wow.
And then it was very, very soon after he got out for that he went to go live with his dad in Virginia, right?
Well, he gets out of prison in 1986, meets Alicia Hernandez in 1987, and they move to Arlington, where his father is living. And his father had done time in El Salvador for murder, and then came up here It's a very large Salvadoran community in Northern Virginia.
Do you know any more details about that murder that his father was convicted for?
I don't have that here in my notes. It probably was in my head at one time, but my head has reached max capacity.
Yep.
So he moves out here with Alicia in 1988 and is living with his father and his stepmother. And it's not long after that that Tina Jefferson is killed. So he commits his first homicide here.
Known homicide, right? Yeah.
That we know of.
But this is the first time I've ever heard you mention
a
stepmother.
24-year-old woman. It's just there in the notes.
Stepmother.
And that must have been something that Alicia testified to. That's how I have it attributed, is to her.
I've had trouble getting court records, and I admittedly haven't been very aggressive about it, but I thought a lot of these things were public information, but it's hard to get court records now just on the internet because I guess somebody gets paid or is trying to get money for them.
Well, there's a couple things. One is that Fairfax County has not kept up with the time and does not make its stuff available to anybody online to this day, except lawyers. And they've only recently started scanning in documents in the last 2 or 3 years. So everything was paper, everything. And that was my great advantage, was that I lived and worked near the courthouse, so I could go get all that paper. And this information would have only come out in testimony, so you'd have to get it from the transcript of Alicia's testimony, which I remember quite well. She was somebody that was very scared to be there.
At the trial?
Yes. And it says here that in August of 1988, 3 months after Tina Jefferson died, she had a son with Prieto. So she would have been pregnant with her son when he committed the murder of Tina Jefferson. And then he would have had a newborn at home 4 months later when he killed Warren and Rachel.
So actually, wait a second. So that means that when he contacted Alicia and said, you need to follow me up to New York in your car, the baby was there too. Likely.
That would make sense.
Unless they're leaving the baby with the stepmom, which is also possible.
So Rachel's car is in Queens on December 5th, even before their bodies are found. Their bodies are not found until the 6th. But that car is first ticketed in Jamaica on December 5th.
Wow.
And so you say that he summoned Alicia up to New York?
This is what Murphy told us, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I don't recall her saying that.
He said, we're going to New York, get in the car and follow me up. And that he was driving the brown car, the brown Corolla.
Right. Which was Rachel's car.
Correct.
Right. But then they came back. And according to her, they moved to Prince William County, the next county south of Fairfax. Prieto, Hernandez, and son moved to Manassas 1989, and September of 1989, Manuel Cermeno is shot to death, a male who's found in a burning car. And the ballistics from that killing matched the ballistics from the other killing.
Which in and of itself doesn't make any sense that the MOs are so all over the place.
Right, exactly.
Do you know anything more about the dad other than that he did some time in El Salvador for a murder?
Yeah, then he did major time here in the state of Virginia for rape. So we moved to 1990, and Prieto starts using the identity of Alicia's brother, Jaime Hernandez, which, that may be the name that Murphy encountered. And in February of 90, Arnoldo Prieto commits rape in Arlington. He's not arrested right away, but it's that same month that Alfredo Prieto and Alicia leave Virginia. Less than 3 months later, in May of 1990, his first couple in the Valley are killed, Stacy Segrist and Tony Giannuzzi. And then there's another couple abducted and killed a month later, in June of 90. And in August of 90, the father, back here in Arlington, Virginia, gets arrested for rape. And I believe he was sentenced to 30 years. I'm sorry, he was sentenced to 40 years in June of 91.
For rape?
Yes. Well, they may have known about his past, for all I know. If he's a convicted murderer and he gets busted again.
Did you ever interview him? I know that.
No, he was in prison.
Murphy interviewed him in prison.
He did?
Yeah.
I'm so jealous. That would have been a good idea. I did not think of that.
I'm sure you did. You just forgot that you thought of it.
Right.
Do you know the name of the stepmom?
I don't have that in here.
But he could theoretically still be in prison, right?
I looked him up. He's not. I looked him up not too long ago.
I really want to also, I think we can find kids. Like, my theory is he was out there doing all this serial raping as well. And were you there in the trials?
Yes. For the first one every day. For the next two, the second trial, I was not there every day. I was trying to keep track of who was testifying. And then the third trial, which was just the sentencing, I think I skipped a bunch of the
Rehashing to
Yeah.
educate the jury.
Correct, exactly. But then was there for more of the sentencing phase. In that third trial, they abandoned the mental retardation defense. And so they did not try to make that a thing. And I still don't know to this day why we were allowed to say mental retardation. It had always been a bad thing then, and it's always been a bad thing since. But in that case, maybe because under Virginia law, those are the terms they use. But the whole thing was the criteria for mental retardation, and did he meet them with his IQ and etc.
Were you present during the execution?
I was.
What's your takeaway from that? We've heard various accounts of his demeanor, his last moments on earth.
Well, from anything you want to share with us, Tom, from your experience, because is this the only execution you've been present for, or have there been others?
No, I watched one other one. I saw one in Missouri. In both cases, they were by lethal injection. Of course, the person is covered. They are given an opportunity to say last words. They lay down. They go to sleep. The curtain is drawn. They're dead. And so, as I've said to a number of people, if you got to go, that's the way to go.
If you or someone you know is connected either personally or as the result of violent crime to Alfredo Prieto, a convicted rapist and killer who lived in and around San Bernardino, California, Arlington, Virginia, and Jamaica, Queens, New York between the years of 1984 and 1990, we'd like to hear from you. Please email us at info@theheromakerpodcast.com.
In Prieto's case, he's walked in heavily guarded. I mean, we are in the bowels of one of the most secure prisons you could be in, but they've still got, 5 guys around him, and they lift him up onto the table. Then the sheet comes down while they put the IV in him. And then they lowered a microphone down and said, "Do you have any last words?" And he said, we couldn't hear all of it, but they recorded it and played it back for us right outside the chamber after it was done. And he said, I want to thank my family and lawyers and supporters. Let's do this, which was just grossly obnoxious, and reiterated to me that this guy was really double evil.
So they dropped the curtain before, so no one could see anything.
No. Then they raised it back up after he's on the gurney. Curtain went back up. Sorry if I left that out in the chronology. The curtain goes back up. He's there. He's not surrounded by people anymore. And there's been a big issue in Virginia about whether or not you should be allowed to have a minister there with you, but I don't think that was something he wanted. We sat in little bleachers looking through the window. I sat right behind Ray Morrow and Casey Lingen and Murph, and we were not allowed to take notepads in, or pens, or watches. So they gave us a little piece of paper, and I sat next to a woman. Actually, she gave me, because I kept bugging her. So finally, she gave me her Fitbit. This isn't her Fitbit, but it made me want to get one. She gave me her Fitbit so we could see what time things were happening, when the last rites were issued, and when he made his statement, and all that stuff. But we had to do it with their pencils and their pads, because it would be too big of a security violation to take in a pen. Certainly not any phones or recording devices. We're watching from here, and then there's another window to our right that we can't see in, but that's where Mrs. Jefferson was, and where Dee Dee Raver was, and where Sally Fayez was. And they were back there, and I guess they could hear. And also sitting with us was the Secretary of Public Safety for Virginia, Brian Moran, in case a call came in from the governor saying, stop the execution. And there was somebody standing on the phone in the actual chamber in case a call came in. Let me just say one other thing. There had been legal proceedings that day in Richmond challenging the method of execution and challenging whether or not the drugs were fresh, whether or not they were expired, or where did they come from, or what are they made of. And the federal judge finally said that get rid of this. And he dismissed all of those appeals. And then it was a sprint down to the actual prison site, which is not where Prieto had spent his final years. It's a separate prison where they have the death chamber in Virginia. So everybody gets sent there when it's their time.
It always amazes me that so much was leveraged for this guy in terms of appeals and trying to keep him off of death row. And once he was on death row, it was just like he's not being well cared for in his prison. And there's all this like fight for him. Can you explain that? Can you share any intel on why so many public dollars were spent on this guy?
It's done in the interests or the appearance of fairness. He was appointed by the Fairfax County Court, two of the best criminal defense lawyers you can get, Peter Greenspun and John Shapiro. I saw Peter in court today. He's still over there pounding the boards, and he's as good as you can get. And the fact that they got 3 trials for this guy shows that they did what is considered in the defense bar a hell of a job. But we paid for it. In my notes, I have, totals of what this cost the taxpayers. The first trial, between the legal fees and the witness fees, and one of the witnesses was paid $73,000. The total cost to the public was $359,000.
And that's in 2007, 8, 7?
6.
Okay.
2006, and then I guess 2007. Second trial, not quite as much, but it didn't look like I totaled that one up, but it's still quite a bit.
And then there's everything after the trials.
Right. And so then there's the post-trial stuff, both the appeals, which he was successful on the first time around. He successfully challenged the instructions to the jury. These things you talk about where once he's in prison, is he being properly fed and cared for? And I'm not mistaken. I think he had success with a lawsuit where he challenged his solitary confinement conditions and that he wasn't getting enough outdoor time or something. And so that is the thing that goes on with prisoners across the country, where they challenge their conditions or they challenge their conviction, in part because they don't have anything else to do. Sometimes they have legitimate beefs. I want to diminish those who are wrongly convicted or those who are badly incarcerated. But for the most part, 98% of those who are incarcerated are well treated, and I'd say 99% of those who are incarcerated are properly convicted. Those are rough numbers by me. I have not researched those numbers, but that's my experience, is that wrongful convictions do happen, but they're a small percentage. I think there's a slightly larger percentage of people who are mistreated in prison.
Do you think either of the defense attorneys would talk to us, considering their client is dead and there's no longer a privilege that attaches?
I would think they would. I would think they should. I think they did their best. They worked with what they had to work with, which was not the issue of guilt or innocence, but simply the issue of life or death, which is the way a lot of death penalty cases start out, where there's not an issue about whether or not this person did it. And here, because of the DNA, the lawyers made the decision not to challenge that issue. They didn't challenge guilt or innocence. They challenged whether or not it's legal to execute a mentally deficient person. And I think they did a great job with that. And they created doubt in the jury in the first trial, which is what caused the mistrial. One person saying he wasn't convinced. And then in the second trial, creating doubt with the judge, who then submitted a flawed instruction to the jury, making them go through the process a third time.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's what defense lawyers do, for better or for worse.
So, Jen, I actually did have a really beautiful conversation with Jonathan Shapiro a couple of years ago, and was very grateful that he spoke with me. He had some very strong words about the criminal justice system. He called it a shit show, I think was one of the things he said. And that's what I'm remembering right now. And he declined to be on the Hero Maker podcast. And I've never met Peter Greenspun. I very much would like to reach out to him. Maybe you can help me do that, Tom. You probably have some contact information for him.
He's probably still practicing law if he saw him in court the other day.
Oh, it was 2 hours ago. It was just a short time ago. I was actually looking for a lawyer for my teenage son. Matters we won't discuss here. The speeding ticket this time. Yeah, he's around. The two of them also represented John Muhammad in the sniper case.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of interesting things to say about that because that guy had some mental illness problems, and they would say they weren't allowed to present that. I watched John Muhammad. He fired them right before the opening statements in the sniper trial.
Wow.
And gave his own opening statement, which I was there for, and which was incomprehensible. And he talked about cookies being in the cookie jar, and you couldn't make sense of what he was saying. And then the prosecutors put on witnesses that sniper John Muhammad was not prepared to cross-examine and or raise objections to. They put on an expert about snipers, but who also had John Muhammad's military records and started reading from them in the trial, which any defense lawyer would say, he can't do that. He doesn't have anything to do with this. The guy was British. What does he know about American military records? But John Muhammad didn't know any better, didn't object. It all came in. Finally, John Muhammad got a toothache and he didn't feel good. And so he restored Peter Greenspun and John Shapiro to the defense. They fought fiercely, but there wasn't much doubt of the guilt there either in terms of witnesses, evidence, ballistics, DNA. They had him dead to rights. And so they were taking the same approach, which was, yes, he did these bad things, but don't execute him because he's mentally deficient. And they weren't able to get that done, in part because John Muhammad wouldn't cooperate with the experts for the government who had to examine him in addition to his own experts. These are great lawyers who've done a lot of big time cases. Peter Greenspun represented Marv Albert when he was arrested back in the 90s for a tryst in an Arlington hotel in which he bit a woman. They know their stuff. And, I guess you could say the sniper case might have been a trial run for Prieto in terms of building a mental health defense, where you're not challenging the merits of the case. You're just saying, don't execute our client. They had some success with that in Prieto.
How instrumental would you say that Rich Perez's testimony, the guy who sat next to Prieto on the airplane flying back for the extradition, had in convicting him?
I don't recall speaking to jurors about this, but I think that was pretty impactful because it showed that Prieto was smart and bilingual. He didn't speak during the trial while the jury was in the room. He only spoke, I think, twice in the 3 cases. Here, Rich Perez says, we sat next to each other and we talked about the war in Iraq, and we talked about this and we talked about that. I think that it made the jury aware that this guy wasn't just some bumbling dope who, barely had an IQ of 70. I mean, here is somebody that's aware of what's going on in the world and conducting cogent, thoughtful conversations with a cop on a cross-country flight. So I tend to think that was a really important moment.
Besides the times when he spoke in the courtroom, did you ever overhear him talking to his attorneys, or did you talk to him?
When he first got brought back from California to Virginia, and they bring him from Dulles Airport to the police headquarters, we somehow knew that he was coming in to the headquarters. It was late on a weeknight, and I was there, and I asked, so he's getting walked in, and what do you ask a guy when he's going past real quick? And I said, how are you going to plead? And he looked at me and he said, not guilty. And he had pretty good comprehension of English there, and he spoke quite clearly to me. And the testimony in the case came out from teachers that he was fine with. He'd picked up English fine, even though his family had moved. His mother had moved to California first and then sent for them. And then they were moved from Salvador to LA, and he adapted fairly well to California public schools and learned English. So I think all of that weighed against him heavily.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it.
One thing that we haven't gotten a lot of in this podcast is his life in Salvador and what happened for him before he came to the United States. And I know that it's influential, I think, in who he became. I think so. It seems like it, even though he has siblings, 4 or 5 siblings who, led decent lives and are still leading decent lives. Did not become serial killers.
Right.
But can you provide any details
So he witnessed a lot of violence in El Salvador, which was at the nadir of its civil war. He witnessed his grandfather get pulled out of their house and shot to death. He saw bodies in the street. And so the defense relied heavily on this for evidence of trauma, post-traumatic stress, as reasons for him to have, not developed properly. They also cited in the trial that he was around farms that were, I don't know if you say fertilized, but there was stuff spread by airplanes from above. And they argued that he had been seriously harmed by ingesting the fumes or the powders that had been spread on these fields by crop dusters. He played in these fields. He wasn't necessarily farming at that age, but he played in these fields, and that he inhaled toxic chemicals, which also had an effect on his intellectual development. That was the argument. I believe that his grandfather was the mayor or some sort of official in the town where they grew up.
Which is San Salvador, I think, the capital.
Right. I think that's right. And then his father apparently was quite abusive. And then his father killed somebody and went off to jail. Let's see, his grandfather, I have it as he was killed in 1981 and that he was the ex-mayor of the town. Now, I don't know if they were in the city of San Salvador themselves. Oh, his father went to prison in 1972 when Prieto was 6. And then his mother left in 1975 when Prieto was 9. So he was then living with his grandparents while his mother was in California and his father was in prison. And then in 1981, when he is 15, his grandfather is murdered. And 2 months later, he is moved to Los Angeles with his brothers and sisters at age 15. And 2 years later, he gets married.
Wow.
He is the youngest of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then there was a mention that one child died. Oh, and he lived in San Martin, El Salvador. So he wasn't in San Salvador. He was in a small town. So he was the youngest of 6, and one had also died earlier. So 1, 2 sisters, 2 brothers.
I did have the opportunity to speak to his brother Guillermo, and I'm hoping that Guillermo will join us on the podcast because I think it would be an incredible perspective to hear what it's like to have a sibling who committed crimes like this.
Right.
But he also spoke about drugs. He felt like drugs had a big impact on who Prieto became. Was that something that the defense team ever talked about?
No, but it's possible because he was deeply involved in gangs when he was in California. The first time when he does a drive-by shooting and leaves and then moves to Virginia. I'm not sure if he was involved in drugs here, but then he leaves Virginia after killing 4 or 5 people, goes back to California and is immediately involved with a gang in Ontario. He had tattoos on his neck from the gangs. And so he had to wear at trial high collared shirts that would cover his tattoos. You could see just a little bit peeking up over the collars, but they made sure every day that his shirts covered his tattoos. Also, the defense made sure that there was a drape over the table that he sat at so that the jury couldn't see that he was shackled at the feet. So they presumably couldn't see his tattoos and they couldn't see that he was shackled because the jury is not supposed to know whether or not a defendant is in custody or not.
Interesting. This case, the sniper case, I'm sure there are many other big cases and small cases too. You're covering these stories from a different balcony. Obviously, it's not the same balcony that an investigator is looking at it from, or the medical examiner or a prosecutor. How do these cases impact you personally and professionally?
For a long time, when I wasn't married and I didn't have kids, it was easy for me to separate from that. And also, I'd say in the first part of my career, I didn't get to know a lot of victims well. It wasn't something in the 1980s that the media was very sensitive to, or the 90s, really. That wasn't something that the media routinely sought out. And the reason I mention victims is because that's what's really changed it for me and made it so much more impactful and difficult was getting to know victims, having kids of my own, to see the pain that they go through. I empathize with it so much more, the pain that victims endure. And I think I'm having some post-traumatic stress disorder of my own in recent years as I watch these people slog through these cases for years. There's a case that I've been following now since 2017 of a guy who was shot dead as he drove away from the U.S. Park Police. And I think we all thought that this would be resolved in a year or two, and we're into year 6, and it's not over. And the family is still miserable, still horrendously miserable. And to watch them go through this is really difficult. And I almost miss the days when I was young and stupid and I would write a story and go home and not care anymore. And now I care, and it's much harder. There was some stuff that I wrote in Kansas City in the 80s that was incredibly insensitive, in part because sometimes I was trying to get a laugh out of somebody's death. One of them was about a guy. The lead said something like, John Smith's day was ruined yesterday when he went out to mow the backyard and found a dead body in his backyard. Well, that dead body is somebody's son or father or brother. And that should never have seen the light of day. And that was really insensitive. And I have some other examples of stuff. And that was what the media did. We've only gradually come around to the awareness, I would say, since the year 2000 or later. Oh my gosh, we should be paying attention to these people and their role. I don't think we did. And, like Sally mentioned in your podcast, that, she suggested to the deputies, how about if we reserve some seats for the families of the victims? That was revolutionary. It seems like common sense now. Of course, you let the family sit up front, but that didn't happen. I was there in the 80s and the 90s, and the family fought with seats like the rest of us. And a lot of places don't have a Sally. They don't have a victim witness coordinator. Some to this day. I mean, Fairfax has it because they're a wealthy county, one of the wealthiest counties in America. But a lot of places don't. The victims are on their own, and they have to hope that the prosecutors or the police are helpful to them. And if you are a family of someone who is shot by the police, victim services people do not help you because they consider your loved one a suspect. They bow out of those cases.
I did not know that. And that doesn't seem right.
I hope that's not true everywhere, but it's true everywhere I've been so far.
Well, let me just ask you this. Around 2000 is when you said that the media started to engage more with victims or survivors, the families, et cetera, and kind of bringing the balance between the deed and the bad guy or gal.
Right.
And that sort of quite naturally means that you now have to bear witness to the harm that these cases cause.
Correct.
Did how you felt about that and being that close and sort of vicariously experiencing people's trauma, did that change for you once you had children of your own?
Absolutely. I couldn't comprehend. I didn't get a sense of people's loss when you have a kid. I didn't have any kids. And so then I had kids. Then I thought I feel like I have some kind of grasp of, oh my God, this is loss. This is pain. And what would I do if I was in that situation? Well, one thing I'd do, I wouldn't talk to a damn reporter. And I'm always amazed that people do. I would crawl up in a small ball if something happened to one of my family members. And the last thing I would do would be talk to Tom Jackman from the Washington Post. That's just my personal view. But some people are more thoughtful and generous than Tom Jackman. And so they do give their time and they do want others to know what has happened. And what I want people to know is I want them to know about the victim. I want them to know the life they lived. And the thing that I say to families is, I'm not calling you or showing up at your door unannounced to talk about this crime. I'm here to talk about your child, your sister, your mom. And I want the world to know about them, not about the bad guy. One thing that the media has done just in the last few years is realized we need to stop glorifying or naming the mass shooters. Just in the last 3 years, we've gotten much better at saying the shooter, the suspect. But before that, those people were named and named and named in headlines and got the fame that they wanted. And that's certainly one of the motives that killers do things like this for the lasting publicity. And like those two teenage kids in Columbine are heroes to some people.
Weirdos.
Right, exactly.
Can you maybe share a little bit more about the behind closed doors conversation for the media in terms of responsibility and things that you are thinking about and looking out for now in terms of how you contribute you just shared something really big, but beyond that, what kind of protocol is being introduced now that you think is actually helping hopefully curb some of, especially these mass shooting and other occurrences?
I wish I could say that it was as formal and thought out as a protocol. It's just sort of been an organic awareness among media to stop being jerks, to lower our level of jerkiness from way up here to slightly here. And I always try to represent our profession honorably and sensitively. I want people to know that we're not here to exploit you. And that's just gradually happening. Now, I will say that the Poynter Institute, which is based in Florida and is this journalism think tank, did convene a nationwide weekly seminar to talk exactly about these issues, about how to deal with victims, how to more sensitively cover crime. And so each week we got on these giant Zooms with people from the Minneapolis paper and the Houston paper and the New York website, and a lot of people talking about these exact issues, how to do this better and not to just exploit crime and get headlines and clicks because things are bloody and horrible. And how can we do our jobs better? And part of it is that we've been getting hammered on for years by victim advocates and cops and prosecutors to use our brains and be more thoughtful and do a better job of presenting both sides and reminding people of the pain inflicted by the bad guy. So we focus on these crimes, and then the trials focus on the crimes, and the sentencing focuses on the crime, and oh my God, the crime was so horrible, and the victims get left behind. I think that this case was probably one of the first, well, probably maybe the sniper case before this, where we really paid attention to the victims in the sniper case. That happened in 2002, and the trials were in 2003. And the victims came and testified, and we got to know them better, and we got to focus on them better, in part because every single one of them was just somebody going about their daily job, and they got shot in the head. And so it horrified everyone. Something Sally said, which is the victims are the only ones who did not sign up to be there. Everyone else, their own actions brought them to the courtroom.
And they were getting paid to be there.
Yep, that's right. That's exactly right.
Wow.
The Williamson County Cultural Arts Commission of Franklin, Tennessee wishes to thank our men and women in blue who help us deliver safe and fun family and community cultural events year-round, including one of the only authentic bluegrass festivals in the country. Bluegrass Along the Harpeth takes place every July, and at the Williamson County Fair in August, and at the annual Tennessee International Independent Film Festival. Check out our full calendar of events at wccac-tn.org.
We have spent a lot of time on the Prieto part of it. If there's anything you want to say about what you learned about these kids, who they got painted for you as, who was Rachael to you, who was Warren to you, who was Tina to you, that's something that's of interest to me too. So anything within there would be really cool.
I felt like they were people that I grew up with, a soccer player and a baseball player, two sports I played and two sports my family played, two sports I grew up writing about. I've known a lot of high school and college baseball players. I've known a lot of high school and college soccer players. I knew where these guys lived, in Vienna and Arlington. I felt like I knew them in a way because, and especially from talking to Dee Dee, who I have a feeling is a great deal like Rachael. And they were just sort of suburban wise asses like me, in a way, who were just starting out, and they'd gone to a good college, and now it was on to the next stage. And that's a great stage to be in, man. Not to be back at 22 years old again. everything in front of you and everything's possible, and then just the worst murders, the worst. I mean, I don't want to rank them or anything, but this is just right up there with the most horrific crimes I've seen committed. And I know when I describe this case to other people and tell them about it, their eyes pop out just like mine did. So the most gruesome killings, followed by 17 years of nothing for that family. I just can't imagine that, not knowing who did this or why or how it all happened. It's they were such good kids, and it was just so unbelievable. I always have wondered who could do something, who could be that bad, that evil to do that, and how did two people that were that smart and athletic fall under his sway, unless, he had a gun and he said, get in the car. But
it is a head scratcher, really. I mean, even to this day, the thing that we have is the DNA.
right,
We don't have any of the context.
right,
And that's true for Tina Jefferson and probably many of the other cases that I'm not so familiar with. But it is the details sort of that help you process these things and file them away, like, oh, that's why them, or that's why he did this, or
right,
and there's so much that's unknown. We literally have what the crime scene tells us, what their bodies tell us, and we have a DNA match. He never made any admissions or confessions. We have
right,
no eyewitness identification. We have no context. And that's
right,
unusual. A lot of cases, the colors get filled in around as you interview more people and you get medical records, or you get this DMV records or a hit off an LPR, you start to put the color around or connect the dots. In this case, it's not there. And even
right,
though the closure, certainly I know, helped the family and all of the friends who always thought, how can two people be snatched off the earth and never have this solved, right? There's still, when your brain tries to process it, there's still a lot missing in this case that I don't think we're ever going to know.
I had hoped that that more would come out, and it didn't really. I mean, we know that he killed more people, but still don't know why.
I feel like those girlfriends, those wives would be really, really helpful. They spent that period of time when he was committing his crimes. They were with him. Not that they would know every detail, but they would know some intimate things about his behavior. And
Right. I agree.
Who should we talk to, Tom? Who have we?
Well, I
Or
love the
maybe
Pointer. I love the Pointer Institute. We should definitely talk to someone from that.
Oh,
Sounds
yeah.
really interesting.
They would like to talk to you about crime coverage in the 21st century. And the woman that ran the thing, I can put you in touch with her. She's great.
That would be awesome. I have a feeler out to Ray Morrow, but have gotten nothing back yet.
He's great.
Text him for me. Can you text him right now?
No.
It's dinner time. You can't disturb them at dinner time.
I'm just imagining Ray is doing his, I don't even know Ray, but he's got to be doing his retirement career, whatever that is. Like, is he fishing right now? It's too cold.
No, he's working for the bar. He's working for the State Bar Association. So Bob Horan just died.
I didn't know that.
The lead prosecutor, the guy that made the deal with Virginia to bring Prieto back, because his thinking was California will never execute this guy. We will get him back here before we will Virginia will conclude its proceedings. And he was right. Even with 3 trials, we got it done while California was still kicking the case around. So what's up with the Fulton family?
Good question. I've never met the Fultons, and I would love to. About the people who were there, definitely Rich Perez is of interest.
He has left the area. I think he's moved to Florida.
So he's the one who's fishing.
Yeah.
Hey, Tom, in addition to who should we talk to?
Yeah.
You had a different vantage point on this than most people. Who were the hidden heroes in the Prieto case?
Well, I don't know who was hidden. I mean, Sally and her crew, certainly did yeoman's amazing work in terms of getting all these people there for 3 trials and then taking care of them, getting them there every day, day after day. And then Ray Morrow, certainly. I mean, Haran was leading the way at first, but then Haran retired and allowed Ray to succeed him. Ray then appointed Haran as a special prosecutor for the second trial. I don't know why Ray wouldn't talk to you. So there's this guy, Detective Jim Mowat, Mowatt. He's like Billy Bob Thornton. And he looks like him. He acts like him. He was an original detective in 1988 on the case, and he came back each time to testify in the trials. And then Bill Wilden was the lab guy, and for many years he was teaching at George Mason.
I think we should also be moving into our final question.
Do you have a final question, Shreems? Because that was mine.
What's for dinner?
The hidden heroes and the who should we talk to? Those were my sort of bring it home questions.
This would be really sweet to hear from you. Sally talked about how it was the dream team on this case. And I know that you, having lived there and worked there for a long time, you know a lot of the players and you befriended a lot of the players, and it's become personal. Is there anything that you would like to share about the work that the folks in Fairfax have done in this case or over the years, and what it's like to be part of that level of commitment and professionalism?
It's quite impressive to watch people who are that good at their jobs do their jobs. They stayed with this case from 1988 to 2005. That was 17 years before they had any idea who their suspect was. And then they stayed with it through these trials, these long, difficult trials that they had to do 3 times. They stayed with it. That was just amazing work. And they didn't have a misstep in any of it. I mean, the judge gave a bad instruction to the jury about how they could find, but that wasn't, well, it could arguably the prosecution's fault, but that was a minor thing. The prosecution wanted him to tell the jury they could sentence this guy to death. And one thing that I'll mention about covering this police department and these prosecutors is that there haven't been any wrongful conviction cases coming out of this jurisdiction. And all the time I've been here, which is now 25 years, I sure as heck didn't watch any, and there haven't been any that have arisen since I've left the Fairfax beat of any of the cases. And they've done this with other cases too. They've just stuck with things. They have the resources, in part because it's not a high crime area. We have 15 to 20 homicides a year in a population of 1.1 million. So when we do have a homicide, they can throw everything at it. And they have the money to hire good prosecutors, and they have good prosecutors running the show, or they did. And so it's been a fantastic education for me to see things done the right way and to see them done fairly and accurately. I've benefited tremendously from getting to watch this close up for all these years, to see people who are really good at policing and prosecuting do their jobs.
That's great.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. It's been really great sitting with you.
Sure.
Thanks to sound mixer and podcast producer Michael Doherty, sound designer Andy Bill of Submachine Audio, and graphic designer Jungleen Bay. Thanks also to me, Hero Maker director and producer Andrea Shreeland. Please subscribe to the show where you listen to podcasts and take a moment to rate us. It really helps the podcast grow. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hero Maker Pod. Want to collaborate or suggest a guest? Please email us at media@theheromakerpodcast.com. The Hero Maker Podcast is a production of Prudent Pictures. Thank you so much for listening.